Now we cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Mark. It's now time for Global Insight, where we connect with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. A US Defense Department report says that China could have 700 warheads within 6 years and over 1,000 by 2030. Amid the growing rivalry between Washington and Beijing, the Pentagon report said that the Chinese government is planning a major expansion of its nuclear forces and that US advantage in the air domain is eroding as China's air and naval air forces shift from defensive to offensive mode, with the ability to launch long-range attacks. Today, we discuss how these two powers compare in military capabilities and what their competition means for countries here in the Indo-Pacific region. And for this, we have Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University, and Joseph Bosco, former China Chair to the US Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to see you both back on the programme. And well, to start things off, Craig, now in July this year, Rear Admiral Mike Studman, Director of Intelligence for the US's Indo-Pacific Command, he warned that it's only a matter of time until China resorts to military force, and he also suggested that the US forces are not ready for what he called that very bad day. And since then, we've seen Beijing flying a record number of fighter jets over Taiwanese airspace, tensions surrounding AUKUS, and now this Pentagon report. Would you agree that a military clash is inevitable?
No, it's not inevitable. Both President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping have said that there's no need for any armed clash between the USA and China. Joe Biden has said there should be competition but not conflict. President Xi Jinping, the UN General Assembly, said China is committed to peaceful reunification of Taiwan, and of course we'll see what he says at the plenum this week. Countries can make decisions and policies to escalate tensions, but also to de-escalate them. And there's no certainty that conflict is inevitable. Here in Japan, for example, the Japanese Ministry of Defense is in negotiations with the People's Liberation Army to try to set up a hotline to diffuse any potential tensions over disputed territories like the Senkaku Islands, which China claims as the Diaoyu Islands. So countries can choose diplomacy rather than to escalate tension.
Well, Joe, you said in the past that while there could be talks, there can also be mistakes when it comes to these military developments. And well, for this Pentagon report for now, the US, well, right now it may be number one in terms of defense spending, and also Washington, of course, far outpaces Beijing in the number of nuclear warheads it has, as well as other core capabilities. But according to this report, China's been increasing its military capabilities at an unprecedented speed, and also its budget has been growing at an average of 8% a year for the past decade. It's fusing all sorts of civil and military sectors together to produce all sorts of innovative military technologies. How quickly is China catching up?
Is that for me, Soo-young?
Yes, that's for you, Joe.
Yes. It's catching up at a disturbing rate, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff mentioned last week. It's almost like a Sputnik moment for the United States when Russia launched the first satellite in the world. Now, China has been accelerating its military spending, mostly in a manner that was not transparent, so that we were not aware of how far and how fast they were proceeding. And we seem almost constantly to be surprised when we discover that they have certain weapons or they have a volume of certain weapons. So it's a very concerning situation, and although it's true that the United States has always had an advantage in nuclear weapons, we've been coming down. We and Russia have been coming down in accordance with various arms control agreements, whereas China has been building up at a much more rapid pace than we expected.
And Joe, according to the Pentagon's report, China plans to modernize its military by 2027 in order to coerce Taiwan into talks for unification. And well, what should the US Taiwan and allies in this Indo-Pacific region really brace themselves for?
I believe that schedule of 2027 is unrealistic. I think it could be much sooner than that, and they do not necessarily have to launch a major amphibious invasion of Taiwan. They can, for example, take over one of the islands, the Pratas or some other island, and use that as a launching pad for later on, much as Russia has done with the Crimea in Ukraine. It takes a piece and then sits back and waits, and then will try to take another piece a year or two later. So I would not place much stock in that 2027 date. We've been surprised constantly by how quickly China has advanced, and we may be surprised again by how quickly they can move and will move against Taiwan.
And Craig, now this year, the US, Russia, China and also North Korea, they all tested hypersonic missiles. How tight is the race to develop this technology, and do you think this is going to aggravate tension in the region?
Well, it's definitely going to aggravate tensions in the region by contributing to the arms race, which is well underway. For North Korea, it's uncertain just exactly how far advanced their technology is. But I see the main danger with hypersonic missiles as their political effect rather than their actual military effects. The advantages that they give of evading early detection and trying to evade ballistic missile defenses is really only very marginal, and the technology itself is still relatively uncertain. But the main effect is going to be encouraging both sides, the United States, China, plus the other actors, North Korea and Russia, to just contribute to this atmosphere of uncertainty and instability. And other countries too, like Japan and even Australia, are going to be researching and developing hypersonic missiles. And all this has the potential to escalate tensions to a degree in which it makes conflict more likely rather than less likely. And so more diplomatic effort needs to be brought to conventional arms control like hypersonic missiles as well as nuclear weapons. And so far there hasn't been the political will demonstrated by any of the major countries of the regions to do so.
And Craig, China's been refusing to join arms control talks with Washington and Beijing, and it's defended its nuclear stockpile as a means of self-defense. Do you think China's going to be up for negotiation, or do you think they're going to press ahead?
No, I don't think China has any incentive to enter negotiations on nuclear weapons, particularly when the United States has 10 times the arsenal of China, about the same. Russia also has about the same size as the US. And we mustn't forget that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970, its Article 6, obliges all the declared nuclear powers to enter into talks for nuclear disarmament. And of course, the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has come into effect earlier this year. So there does need to be more diplomatic initiatives to try and engage in nuclear disarmament talks. President Donald Trump abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, partly because he said China wasn't involved, but no real effort was made to replace it. Joe Biden did manage to have the New START treaty with Russia renewed in February this year for another 5 years. And instead of just renewing New START, there could be a new effort made to have a new, broader nuclear arms control treaty which can encompass all the nuclear powers. So that's another opportunity for greater diplomacy that all the nuclear powers could engage in.
Well, for now, it seems China's nuclear capabilities are growing and growing still. And, well, Joe, US allies have been deeply concerned about the possibility of Washington adopting a no first use policy, particularly as it seems that China is ditching its own pledge. Do you think Joe Biden might change his mind about pushing ahead with the policy now with this Pentagon report out? And what do you hope to see in the US's nuclear policy for 2022?
I do, in fact, believe that not only this report, but China's rapid development of these other weapons and its aggressive posture in terms of its rhetoric and its moves in the region will discourage Biden from proceeding with a no first use declaration. I think that his instincts are probably in that direction, but I think his advisors and the real situation on the ground will deter him from taking that step. And so I think our allies also will play a role in not pressuring, but urging him not to take that step. And I think he will this time actually listen to them and not move ahead with a no first use policy.
And Joe, it seems that, well, America's main competitors, China and Russia, they've recently been joining forces. They conducted their first ever joint naval patrol in the Western Pacific, following a combined command exercise in the EC, which really highlights this deepening defense cooperation between them. And of course, this also comes after they reportedly operated under a joint command for the first time this summer. How far do you think this Moscow-Beijing collaboration will go?
Well, you know, for a long time, American officials and diplomats would take pride in the fact that the United States has so many allies and relationships around the world, and that we would always say that, well, China has none except perhaps North Korea. Well, now they do have one. Russia under Putin seems to be moving much closer. They may have their economic tensions and rivalries, but militarily and in terms of the security relationship, they are moving much closer together and operating their military units at sea and in the air in a way that suggests that they would consider operating together against the United States should a conflict emerge. So I believe that it is a situation that is evolving and not to the West's advantage. The Chinese and the Russians are taking the posture that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they are now collaborating much more, and it's something we need to worry about and to hopefully pressure Russia, if possible, to consider its long-term economic situation with China and not to get involved militarily with them. But that's a long shot at this time.
Well, Craig, here in the Indo-Pacific, where there are so many allied countries of the US, there's a lot of attention on how the US is going to tackle these evolving issues. And, well, it looks like, well, in the past, the US has definitely shown some preference for an offshore balancing strategy, particularly now given its domestic political situation. Do you think the US is going to pursue an active military build-up to counter China in the Indo-Pacific, or expand AUKUS or something like that? What kind of strategy should countries here expect?
Well, the United States is already engaging in an extensive up of its forces. The Trump administration began the Pacific Deterrence Initiative last year, and it was voted on by the Congress. So more money and resources are going to go in forward projecting military forces being stationed through more bases in the region. And AUKUS, the new agreement between the US, UK and Australia, is part of that. And while its plan is to have Australia develop nuclear-powered submarines in the long term, maybe in 20 years, in the meantime, that could mean that nuclear-powered submarines are based in Australia by the Royal Navy and the US Navy. And there is speculation that AUKUS could be expanded further to other countries. Japan is often raised as the first contender, so AUKUS could become JAUKUS. However, there will need to be have the diplomatic ructions sorted out first. Australia and France, of course, in the past week had this extraordinary diplomatic dispute over the deal with France's nuclear conventional powered submarines being cancelled. And it needs to be remembered too that Japan just this last week has had its election. The LDP government of Mr. Kishida was re-elected, and its policy is to double its defence spending to 2% of its GDP. So at the moment, it seems that US allies like Australia and Japan, and potentially South Korea, which of course has had its missile range restrictions lifted by agreement with the US this year. All these US allies are part of this expansion of US military power in the Pacific.
And lastly, before we go, Joe, it seemed that Beijing and Moscow were snubbing Washington as their government leaders. They didn't turn up at the COP26 conference, and they set their goals for carbon neutrality a decade later than the 2050 target of most countries and the target that Joe Biden was aiming for. Do you think Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi, when they meet later this year, do you think they'll be able to improve their relations in any way?
Well, you know, there are different ways to improve relations. One way is through making concessions and trying to win the favor of the other party. The other is through a very firm message of deterrence and warnings that they are pushing too far, too fast. I'm hoping that Biden will take the latter approach and indicate that although he may have a personal relationship with Xi Jinping, as Trump says he did, that the interests of our nation and their nation may well collide unless Chinese policy changes in the near future. It's been extremely aggressive and getting more so, and hopefully Biden will tell them that, as he did earlier, that the U.S. will not concede on its basic values and basic interests. But that's not an easy sell, and Xi Jinping can be expected to push back very firmly and indicate that China has its own red lines and core interests. So I think we're in for a very testy period for the next several months at least, until they get an actual understanding that the United States has red lines as well.
Right, it's a very testy period indeed for this Indo-Pacific region, and while we're going to have to end the interview here today. That was Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University in Tokyo, and Joseph Bosco, former China Chair to the US Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.